How's it going, everybody? We're back here again with this week's tier list for Pioneer. Just to start, once again, because there were some questions last week, decks on this list have to fit at least one of these criteria. They have to have finished in the top 16 of one of the two challenges this past weekend. They have to have a 4-0 or a 3-1 in the prelims that occur during the week. Or they have to have at least 4 showings in the last 2 weeks on MTG Goldfish. So I'm using that as a standard basis to figure out what decks we should rank. That doesn't mean that decks that don't show up aren't worth playing or aren't good meta choices. They just aren't showing up right now. The other thing I want to talk about before we get into this is that these results include Lurrus. And obviously on Monday, Lurrus was banned. So we're going to address it as we hit decks that did play Lurrus. There were only a couple that made the tier list, but it did still show up as the most represented deck for challenge top 16s, so definitely worth considering that as well. So let's start at C tier. We're going to get rid of D tier for this week just because it was a short week. There weren't a lot of prelims, not a lot of decks snuck in, unlike last week. So we're going to start with C tier this week. We're going to start with one of the Lurrus decks that did show up this week, and that is Heroic. Had one challenge top 16. This isn't a deck that I think gets hit too hard by the Lurrus ban, especially because you can just add Feather now. But I think that Heroic is still in a position where some of the decks focusing in on sacrifice elements with Fatal Push get too many pieces of interaction, especially with Voltage Surge in the Red-Black Oni Cult decks. So I think Heroic is still a little bit of a ways off from a resurgence, but as decks in the more mid-range and combo side of things pick up, Heroic becomes a better option. Next up is Jun's Sacrifice. This is a deck that didn't put up any top finishes this week, but did show up pretty repeatedly just outside of the top 16, as well as some 5-0s. This version was more focused on the Korvold package as opposed to the Karn package we were seeing before, or the Bolas' Citadel package of old. I think leveraging the power of Korvold, especially as decks have a hard time answering a large creature that is more than 4 CMC right now, is a good option. And a lot of the sacrifice decks have good tools to attack the control decks post-board, especially if they're playing Trail of Crumbs. Next up, we have Abzan Greasefang, a small downgrade from last week. I think Abzan Greasefang is still a solid deck. I think there's still a lot of growth potential for this deck, but I think people are starting to get more accustomed to how to play against it. I think the decks are solidifying more into a stock position, and as that happens and people get more used to playing against a deck like this, there will be more ability for people to not lose to a turn 3 Greasefang or be able to interact with the graveyard profitably. I think it's a deck that will certainly come around in the meta again, but for right now, I think it's being pushed out a little bit. Next up, we have Mardu Oni Cult. This would be B tier if it wasn't for the Lurrus ban, in my opinion. This deck came in 6th place in the challenge last week. With the addition of some of the white creatures, we had seen that previously, but this version plays Rite of Oblivion and Hidden Stockpile, leveraging the benefit of having multiple ways to turn on Revolt and multiple things you want to sacrifice in the Red-Black Oni Cult deck. I think this deck is very powerful, and moving forward, especially as we head towards the next set, which will introduce the new Triomes, I think having decks like this that are a little bit more synergy focused but could use 3 colors might be a good place to look. But for right now, I think it is the weaker of the Oni Cult decks, and it's hard for me to rank a deck that is this new with only a singular result all that much higher, especially when we have seen how good Black-Red Oni Cult is right now. Next up, let's move to B tier, and this is going to include 2 decks that won the challenges this weekend, which I know may sound a little odd, but I think that both decks overperformed their position. But I think it is still fair to say that they are B tier in that I would not be shocked to see them have good results. I don't think they're favorites to win the tournament, but as we saw just last week, they still can. First off, let's look at Lotus Field, which won the first challenge of last weekend. I think this deck is still very well positioned. The really aggressive low-to-the-ground decks like Heroic are no longer really showing up, as we saw. But the place where Lotus Field takes some hits is that we're seeing a resurgence of decks like Nivtalite, Winota, and these Black-Red Oni Cult decks that can kill you, but also interact with your hand, especially decks like Blue-White Control that are able to interact favorably with your key spells. Next up, we have 5-Color Humans, a deck that Though when I was playing it wasn't super impressive, I have seen how well it can operate at its best draws. I think the addition of Catilda and other ways to maximize your mana in the mid game really helps this deck from some of the original builds that were out a few weeks ago. I think Humans has a good future in the meta. I think it's another one of those aggro decks that will continue to show up, but I don't have high hopes for it outpacing some of these other decks like Oni Cult or Mono Green Karn that are currently showing up more regularly. I think it'll be a fixture in the aggro meta for now, but I don't think it does anything so revolutionary as to really shake up the meta itself. Next up, we have Black-Red mid-range, a deck that I honestly think gets a little bit better as we start to see people trying to fight on a more fair axis with the aggro decks without Lurrus. They don't have any way to really grind you out in the mid game, and the Black-Red mid-range deck was already pretty good against Lurrus decks. The advantage you have by having powerful planeswalkers, good hand disruption, and interaction allows you to fight against a lot of the creature decks that are floating around. And while you are certainly disadvantaged against some of the over-the-top decks like Karn or Blue-White Control, I think you have a good matchup into a lot of the decks like Humans, like Heroic, like any of the red burn decks that very well might pop up now that you don't have to be red-white or red-black to play Lurrus. Next up, we have Nivtalite, which put up another good weekend with 4 challenge top 16s, many of which in the top half of those results. I think that Nivtalite is very well positioned if you see things like Jeskai Ascendancy and Lotus Field coming in, having access to things like Slaughter Games, Unmoored Ego, as well as just a really big 6/6 flyer that's hard to answer. It's one of the big reasons that I think you have a good matchup into things like Oni Cult is there's very few pieces of removal to interact with your big threats, and having cards like Shadow's Verdict and Extinction Event can help clear up some of the problematic permanents, along with Kolaghan's Command and Nahiri. Moving on now to the A tier. These are again decks that I think are above average chance to be top 8, as well as potentially win any of the big challenges this week. I think they're well positioned, especially considering that we're going to have a lot of decks being tested out this week with the new bans in place. First up, we have Bant Spirits, a deck that I always like to call sort of the underrated deck of Pioneer. It comes in very well against some of these decks like Nivtalite, Lotus Field. You have a lot of matchups where decks want to race you but can't effectively block, so you're always advantaged if you choose to be on the offensive, or you can block reasonably with your high toughness creatures. You have good pieces of interaction, and if you get in under any of these mid-range decks, you can easily coast 1 to 2 creatures to victory. I think Bant Spirits is the best of the Spirits builds right now, and I think that you are well positioned, especially for this weekend, as people play various decks that may not be able to interact favorably with your synergies. Next up, we have Mono Green Karn, a deck that continues to impress, putting up good finish after good finish with top 4s in both challenges this weekend. I think this is a deck that attacks a lot of the mid-range decks of the meta. Nothing really changed from last week in that regard, but I think people are getting more and more used to playing against this deck. So I would say that as we get more familiarity with all of the different intricacies, there will likely be cards found that have a better way of targeting this deck. It's probably the best over-the-top mid-range deck to play, but if we start spiraling more and more into control, you end up in a bad way if your opponent can interact with your key spells and keep the board clear. Next up, we have the first deck to drop from S tier, and that is Blue-Red Phoenix. I think Phoenix had a good weekend, but as far as Phoenix goes, it was pretty lackluster. I think a lot of the decks started targeting Phoenix after having such a powerful week the week before, and I think that in reality, Phoenix got to prey on a lot of the Lurrus decks. That was some of your best matchups. Just by being able to favorably interact, they couldn't close out quick enough once you remove their threats, and then you were able to take over with Thing in the Ices early or Hall of the Storm Giants late. I don't think that Phoenix per se got worse, but I think that decks like Blue-Eye Control picking up steam is not a good sign for Phoenix right now. I think the more that I've been playing that sort of matchup and talking to people who play it regularly, it does feel like Blue-White Control is gaining more and more ground. Next up, the last of A tier, and to be honest, I think after the week this had, it would be a solid S tier deck if it weren't for the Lurrus ban, and that is Black-Red Oni Cult. We had this in A tier last week. It stormed the challenges, putting up 7 top 16s as well as 2 prelim finishes. It was the dominant deck of the weekend. Even though it didn't win either challenge, it was certainly the best option if your goal was to put up a good finish. I think the majority of the top 16 on the first challenge was Black-Red Oni Cult, and many of the top 16 as well on the second. I think that this deck is incredibly strong now that you have access to potentially Bone Crusher Giant or Graveyard Trespasser, though you have to balance your curve with your 1-mana red artifact. You do still have a lot of potential to gain some ground, though you will probably be a little bit worse in the end game without Lurrus. I think that the deck will still present a great place in the meta, and honestly, I wouldn't be shocked if this moves back into S tier soon. I just want to see what the builds look like without Lurrus. Now we have S tier. After a lot of thought from last week, I think that Blue-White Control solidified its spot as an S tier deck. Having 5 top 16s this weekend, I think the Wandering Emperor as well as Farewell give this deck tons and tons of good tools. Farewell especially good against these Oni Cult decks that otherwise would have problematic permanents for you to interact with. I think Blue-White Control is a staple for right now, and until the meta truly shifts to a point where burn decks start to come back with force, I think Blue-White Control will remain an S tier deck, especially in this mid-range meta we have brewing after the Lurrus ban. Finally, the last S tier deck is Winota. Winota came in second place in both challenges this weekend, and while that is an incredibly impressive feat, it isn't the only thing. I think that with mid-range being the decks to beat right now, Winota can get in under them. Decks have a hard time interacting with your creatures at instant speed outside of things like Fatal Push or sideboard cards, and especially as we have a lot of decks that tap out to interact their game plan, I think Winota is the best if you were talking about ships passing in the night. While I think people can adjust, especially if Phoenix picks back up and Winota will drop back down the tiers, I think Winota is absolutely an example of a deck that thrives in these mid-range metas, and I wouldn't be shocked to see it taking down the tournament, moving up 1 slot in each of the challenges this week. So with that, thanks everybody for tuning in. I hope this was helpful, and I'll catch you around for next week's tier list. Hey there. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you've enjoyed this content on either Twitch or YouTube. If you did, please like or subscribe. If you didn't, be sure to leave a comment down below. I promise not to read it. Until next time.